Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third in the series of programs, Expanding Modes of Practice, which the Architectural League is very pleased to be presenting in collaboration with LOG. I'm Rosalie Ginevro, the Executive Director of the League. We inaugurated this series a couple of months ago with the thought, as we made the transition to online programming, that being able to probe different ways of practicing architecture with firms that are experimenting beyond the borders of traditional practice would be a worthy alternative to our usual First Friday events. Tonight's event was postponed from last Friday evening in support of and respect for the extraordinarily powerful and important movement that has coalesced to demand an end to anti-Black racism in American life. The catalyst for this series is the most recent issue of LOG, the theme of which is expanding modes of practice. The issue is guest edited by Bryony Roberts, and we were delighted when LOG's editor, Cynthia Davidson, and Bryony responded enthusiastically to the idea of doing a joint series of programs around LOG 48, which focuses on practices that, as Bryony writes, are re-asking the questions that haunted the 20th century. How to find shared realities, how to gather knowledge, how to practice. Bryony is principal of the design and research practice Bryony Roberts Studio, and she teaches design studios and seminars at Columbia GSAPP. Her own studio creates projects in the public realm, drawing on methods from architecture, art, and historic preservation. We are extremely happy to welcome to tonight's program the three founders of Interboro Partners, an architecture planning and urban design firm that has shaped their work around a deep commitment to community engagement and to the development of processes and tools and attitudes that are most effective in serving communities and generating genuine engagement and participation. All three partners are also educators. Georgeen Theodore is an architect and urban designer and professor and director of the infrastructure planning program at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Tobias Armborst is an architect and planner and associate professor of architecture and urban studies at Vassar College. Daniel Doka is a planner and professor in practice at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. A major book on their analysis of urban form called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion was published in 2017. We plan to have the program tonight last about an hour to 8 p.m. or so. You'll be able to pose questions to Interboro and to Bryony by using the question function on Zoom. Please, please, please start sending your questions early, and we'll start the Q&A at about 7:40 or 7:45. So please have your questions in by then if you can. Please don't wait until the last 5 minutes of the program to send your question because we likely won't be able to get to it. Just before we start, I want to say thank you to the League's program director, Ann Rieselbach, and staff members, Katarina Flaxman, Katie Rotman, and Nanase Shirakawa for their work on this program. And again, thank Cynthia Davidson for her collaboration and support for this series. And just a reminder that this program is eligible for CEUs. There is information in the chat box, or will be in a minute, for those of you who are interested in registering to receive them. So now, please welcome Dan, Georgeen, and Tobias.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Rosalie, and all of the ARC League, and Cynthia and Bryony from LOG for bringing us into this conversation. Just a short and important acknowledgement. The ARC League has been an important institution for our firm, starting early in our practice back in 2005 when we won the Young Architects Award, the League Prize. And then in 2011, when we were selected as Emerging Voices, which marked an important milestone in our practice. So thank you. And we'd also like to thank the participants in this online conversation. Thank you for being here. These are obviously difficult times, and we know that people have a lot on their minds right now with the COVID crisis and the rightful protests. And we want to begin by stating Black Lives Matter. And as architects and urbanists, we stand in solidarity with those fighting to end racial injustice, which is so fundamentally embedded and expressed in urban space. And we remain committed to leveraging whatever we have to offer as architects and designers in helping in the fight against spatial inequity and injustice.
What do we do? As Rosalie mentioned, we're architects, planners, and urban designers in Brooklyn, and since recently also in Detroit. Our projects are mainly projects for the public realm. For one, public spaces, sometimes temporary, sometimes self-initiated projects, sometimes stitched together with limited resources, and often part of larger community development processes. Two, planning projects for neighborhoods, cities, and regions, where we typically work for and closely with city and regional planning agencies. Three, writing, visualizing, doing research. But we always try to do research or find ways to represent our research in a non-white papery way. And four, we do artifacts, engagement, what we call engagement artifacts. So these are planning tools that help visualize and democratize planning processes, tools that are not so much about planning for the public space, but about making planning processes themselves more public and bringing new actors into the process. So that's it in a nutshell. So Georgeen mentioned that we did our last official Architecture League talk for Emerging Voices in 2011. And so we thought to kick this event off by giving you sort of a 5 to 10 minute update on what we've been doing, what we've been up to since then. Actually, at the time of that talk in 2011, we were in the middle of completing holding pattern, our installation for MoMA PS1. That was a temporary installation at PS1 in the courtyard there. And our design was based on many conversations with PS1 neighbors. So we talked with 200 institutions and people from the neighborhood of Long Island City, where PS1 is based, and asked them if there was something they needed that we could design, use at PS1 during the summer, and then deliver to them in the fall. So this became a project. It was a design project, but one that was really based on this conversation, that it became much larger than the installation itself. And it was an installation that was the result of a conversation with different people. And importantly, it also became a setting for conversations between people and institutions that don't typically interact. Especially since in a form of gift exchange, many of these people that we worked for, our new clients in the neighborhood, sort of reciprocated by doing programming in the courtyard. So this was really an important moment for us, an important project for us and the way we think about design with many actors. And following holding pattern, then we increasingly designed places specifically for the purpose of fostering that sort of interaction conversation.
And to do this, I think we've been increasingly relying on what we call conversation pieces. So for example, here's a table we made to get us, to get people to tell us what's right and wrong about Cambridge. There's a puzzle that's meant to give us people's, oh, this is the table as well. And this is a puzzle that's meant to give us people's preferences for what to do with land. Some available by way is a, next slide, is a game that lets people reimagine the right of way in Cambridge. Next up is a model to kind of solicit ideas for how to design a park in Greece. Next up is a activity that lets kids give input on new uses for vacant parcels in Detroit. Sometimes education and empowerment are our goals, so we just made this game, the Game of Zones, to teach people about land use and zoning in Detroit. We also make a lot of newspapers to get people involved. So this one is about a comp plan that we did in Cambridge. And we've done others about the Detroit zoning code and so on. workshops, exhibitions. We do whatever it takes to basically get people to talk to us and talk to each other. Why do we do this? Designers and planners do community engagement for all kinds of reasons. For some, it's a scope requirement that results in empty evening meetings and obligatory democracy exercises. At worst, it can be an act of coercion, an opportunity to sell some predetermined, independently generated idea. Increasingly, community engagement is a PR opportunity, a photo op stage to showcase a designer's willingness to work with the community. But rarely is it what it should be, namely an open-ended, inclusive, and meaningful and fun dialogue that generates something unique and something site-specific. So we call this co-design, and we see ourselves sort of deploying engagement, observation, listening, to create co-authored urban environments. So, you know, a recent example would be this project that we're working on in St. Louis. This is the Forest Park Playscape that's presently under construction, and it'll open in the fall. So the scheme is a kind of pearl on a necklace scheme. So we designed these play areas, each with a different ecological theme, and we're linking them with an ADA accessible path. This being a place for kids, we enlisted a lot of kids to help us design it. So we had this kind of color forms activity. We asked kids basically to just make something that looked like fun. The hope that kids would kind of think up crazier, more fun things than we ever would, and they did. This is Adam here and his kind of crazy collage. And so what we did was we just sort of took these collages, kind of interpreted them, and built them. So on the right, that is a shot of the park being built, and you can see the resemblance there. And you know, we did this with the help of the Youth Advisory Committee, who kind of helped us with the process, in part by prototyping these crazy fun things. And I think, like the holding pattern project that Tobias just showed, the idea behind co-design is to build a constituency with the basic idea that, you know, people are more likely to visit a park if they help design it. So we hope that kids will come to this place and say, you know, see that crazy rock stump thing? I made that.
So a lot of our planning work is actually in Detroit, where we started working in 2005. Initially, we worked independently using tools of design as a form of research. For example, this project here, Improve Your Lot, a project that was really about finding a hidden story about everyday practices amidst, or maybe you could say obscured by, the then spectacular narratives of decline and rebirth of the city that were popular at that time. So our project was about making visible, visualizing, and advocating for what we called blotting, an existing transformative practice of Detroit residents who expanded their properties by buying or taking or borrowing adjacent land, and forming new patterns of land ownership and new modes of land tenure. So in our more recent planning work for the city, on the rewriting of the signage ordinance, on the city's new zoning code, and in this project, our neighborhood plan for Campout Davidson Banglatown, we continued with this observation of homegrown practices. And we tried to help these homegrown practices find their way into policy. For example, by developing a land bundling program in which multiple city-owned vacant parcels are bundled together and sold to local groups. So the planning department really wanted us to help them figure out what to do with its vacant city-owned land in this neighborhood. And in this area, there was really a lot of it. You can see it here in these blues and oranges and yellow. Basically everything that's not gray is vacant and city-owned. So in our plan, we tried to facilitate these homegrown extensions through these programs. But one of the really interesting things here was that some of the land that appeared vacant was actually being stewarded by residents taking care of vacant land outside of their actual territory. And of course, this form of land tenure, you can't find in an actual database. The city doesn't give you the kind of like GIS layer at the beginning of the project. You can't really actually identify it by looking around. The only way to get this information is by talking to people in the neighborhood, in community meetings, focus groups, but also in more informal settings. For example, like this ice cream truck that doubles as a neighborhood map that we had driving around the neighborhood. The ice cream truck as a very everyday but also ubiquitous piece of urban infrastructure that in this part of Detroit becomes a space of conversation and information gathering.
Very quickly, the third trajectory of work since 2011, Rosalie mentioned it, the arsenal of exclusion and inclusion, which we've been working on for about the past decade. It's a book, but it's also a number of exhibitions, conversations, and publications. The book is a book about the spatial politics of American cities, taking on the question, who gets to be where, by documenting policies, practices, and physical artifacts, informal, formal, explicit, implicit, that shape access to particular housing and the public realm. So this book came out in 2017, and we're just getting ready to publish the second edition, paperback edition. And so we've been working on the preface for the last 3 or 4 months, which has been, of course, an interesting time for this, as particularly the question of access to the public realm has taken quite a few turns, right? And first with COVID, where a lot of the entries here in the book were really turned upside down, and absence from public space all of a sudden became a measure for care for others. Of course, also the question who actually can afford being absent from public space. And then shortly after that, and simultaneously, the moment that we still live in, where Black Lives Matter and the protests really powerfully asserted the importance and the importance, the physical presence in public space, just having people in streets and in the public realm. And that's a quick update.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Georgeen and Dan and Tobias for sharing your work. Also to Rosalie and Anne and the Architectural League for organizing this series. It's been a real pleasure to be able to build on the log issue that we worked on with Cynthia Davidson. So just as a little bit of context, the driving question behind this latest issue of log was really how architecture can retool its methods of research and design to address both the systemic and interpersonal conditions of social inequity. And the issue was put together over the last 1.5 years, motivated by the urgency of addressing persistent structural problems, as well as the promising emergence of practices that combine methods from architecture, planning, and activism, like Interboro does, to create more inclusive and responsive design processes. So the practices in this issue are redesigning process as much as architectural form. And the relevance and urgency of these themes is now becoming, painfully clear with every week that goes by, first with the COVID outbreak and its consequences, and now with the national protests against racial injustice. So in the middle of these difficult realities, it's been really meaningful to speak with practitioners in this event series, first WXY and then Justin Garrett Moore, and now Interboro, who've really devoted themselves in their careers to developing inclusive design processes by developing methods of co-creation or co-design, as Daniel was talking about, with the communities in which they work. So I'll be asking some questions to Interboro, and then we're going to transition into a Q&A with the audience through the Q&A chat function. So feel free to start typing your questions now, and then we'll open it up at 7:45. So 7:45 to 8, I'll be reading out those questions. So to start with, I think it's important to address this moment that we're in, and you all did that really beautifully in your introduction. And I wanted to sort of expand on that a little further and just hear your thoughts on, in this moment of national attention to racial injustice, something you've already worked extensively on and written about. Has this prompted any new thinking on your part, any sort of new aspirations for the practice?
The awkward silence that always happens when someone gets asked a question on Zoom. The answer is absolutely 100%. I think we've all been incredibly inspired by what we've seen. It's amazing. And we've had the good fortune to participate in some of the protests in our respective locales. And I think we've been incredibly inspired by it. And I think if anything, it's really renewed our commitment to use the tools of planning, of architecture, of urban design, to dismantle the structure of white supremacy, right? And to continue to investigate and interrogate the ways that the built environment has been shaped by white supremacy, but also to use the tools of planning that we have at our disposal to undo some of these things and create a less racist world. Planning, as probably a lot of people know, has been complicit in erecting some of these structures, right? In the book, which looks at 156 weapons of exclusion and inclusion, many of them were wielded by states and by planning offices. That's a story that's pretty well known by now, and in any case, we don't have time to talk about it. But that's our profession, that's our world, and we can't do it. We can't do it all ourselves, of course. But I think we have to recognize that we have an obligation as people who work on and in part shape the built environment to do a lot better.
And I'm interested in how your practice sort of pretty early on was tackling these questions through a sort of interdisciplinary merging of architecture, urban planning, urban design. And I think you were pretty inventive with process from the beginning, I'm guessing as part of this intentional effort to ask questions about who has authorship in the built environment, whose voices are heard. And I'm curious about that decision, at the beginning. Was that an effort? Was it sort of a critique of the existing planning practices? And what was the intention in bringing in some of these methods of what had historically been, ethnography into ways of designing?
I think that we started the practice really out of a more sort of really interest in research. So coming out of grad school, and not necessarily with the goal to start a professional practice, but to continue some of the conversations that were going on in school. We were in planning and urban design programs. So there was, even though those disciplines are very related, there was already sort of a little bit of an interdisciplinary maybe setup there between architecture and planning. And there was also a bit of a this is in the early to mid 2000s, sort of a dissatisfaction with some of the professional options we had and some of the divisions that were built up between architecture and planning, which we thought were not always helpful. And so that was really sort of that's how we started out, as trying to work between those fields and to really do design that is informed by the different forces that are out there and that are interesting and that are evil and that are good, right? So that's that network of different actors and forces that act up in architecture. We were really interested in understanding that better as practitioners. And on the other hand, we were interested in questions of planning without always having to revert to some of the methods that were maybe in place in planning that sometimes seemed almost to be, let's say, not sympathetic to design creativity or design thinking. So that, yeah, that would be really, it was really the starting point for us. And as we built our practice, then of course we want to understand what is this network that we're working in, what are the forces that act up on architecture, and that is also in a way where that book comes from, not as we didn't really write it as or edit it. We have to say there's 50, I think, different authors in the book. So it's really, we brought them together and edited, but really not as scholars, but as practitioners to want to better understand where we can actually be, where design can be useful, or where design can act in this larger network.
And, I think that certainly we formed our practice in school together, and then we started out doing more research-based projects, but certainly we were lucky relatively early in our practice to do projects with, like say, community organizations, but particularly governments that already had established practices of community engagement. And like one of the earliest projects that we did, one of the earliest planning projects we did was for the city of Newark. And at that time, you know, we were working with in the kind of the standards that the city had done in the past, like with the community meetings, you know, with the big community meetings. And one of the things that we realized then was that, you know, the people who were going to those meetings, it was the same group all the time, and we tried to take a critical approach, but at the same time work within that framework of the way that the city was doing it. And we brought new tools to the table to try to make contact with different groups and organizations that weren't part of the process. And we've really been trying to build on that since then. And we've, I would say that we're a critical practice, but at the same time, we have, we're not totally outside, because we also have been working with really, you know, great cities like in Detroit and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Newark, and also in New York City, like with the Department of Health. And I think that nowadays people are really hungry for figuring out ways to cross those boundaries between different agencies, but also different groups. And so we've been able to, I don't know, just maybe through being really perseverant, like who thought that they would ever let us use an ice cream truck, but somehow we did it. And so it's been a journey.
Yeah. And can you talk about maybe some of those tools more specifically? Because it seems like you developed pretty unique tools for bringing in both, you know, input from communities, but also, as Tobias, you mentioned, injecting a kind of design sensibility and playfulness into the planning process. So how do you come up with the sort of objects, the literally vehicles, if it's an ice cream truck, like what are the sort of the mediums that you cultivate in order to shift, you know, both ends of that spectrum?
So maybe I can take a stab at that. So we really approach the process. And so we're really, what we're interested in, or one of the things we're interested in, is not designing the final product, or not only designing the final product, but really designing the process, right? And to think about that in the same way we're thinking about interesting, fun, and good design that will be there at the end. We're also thinking about how do you get there, and what is the process here, and specifically the process of, well, having conversations, right? And really not only, as you say, not only as a way of disseminating information or getting input, but conversations like we have in our office, like architects have in their offices or in their studios, design conversations, right? Design, not obviously, I think that's I think generally accepted now that it's not a solitary endeavor, but it is very conversational, right? And we, as we design together in the studio, those conversations can also be larger than just us and consultants, and ideally they involve people that are not usually part of those conversations, and that just makes it more interesting. But we need the right ways to start that, and to also in a way inspire, or to show something that's just more interesting than a bunch of Post-its or those typical tools, right? That might be surprising, and we do that, or our ambition is to do that in a very specific way, right? So the ice cream truck, for example, since you mentioned it, is not just, you know, oh, fun ice cream truck, but it really is just so much part of the say infrastructure in that part of Detroit, and it really is one way of getting to talk to people that would never ever come to a community meeting, right? Because this thing just pulls up in front of your door and you know how to use it. And then if you can also talk to a person who is, you know, there with the ice cream truck, then great, right? So there's also, sorry, I'm talking too much here, but there's also the ambition of being very, very specific in designing something the way we operate as designers, but in a specific site for a specific group, for a specific community.
Right.
Mm-hmm. If maybe I could also add on to that, I think that one of the things, Tobias talked earlier about holding pattern and why that was an important project for us. And I think that one of the things that we have been working on over the years is really creating engagement events which are actually spaces of engagement, right? So, and like using the tools of design, of architecture to actually create a space where people come together. And so like Dan showed the table in Cambridge, which is, it's an object and it's designed and it has a materiality and aesthetic, but it also, it is creating a space where people can come together and interact. And we've tried to do that in a lot of, I think the ice cream truck is also that is representative of that. And so I think that that's one thing that we're really striving for, but also trying to do it in different ways. And with each project, trying to look at what might be the specific opportunity to connect with a group that we wouldn't normally connect with, and then really just being kind of open-minded, and we brainstorm together and think about what might be a way to do that. And then the other thing I think is that I think a lot of, and maybe it's more normative now, but I think that the other thing that we've tried to do is really use kind of, let's say, almost like everyday things, like the ice cream truck, but also like a table or a game, and not really we'll make clear that it's not just a technical process, but that it's something that is accessible and easy to engage with, and we've tried to bring our design sensibilities in that through making them beautiful and fun to hold, but at the same time like really make it more part of like everyday experience as opposed to something that is a part or let's say, seemingly belonging to a particular discipline or certain profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that really comes through clearly in the work. And I'm also wondering about the sort of labor of community engagement. This is something that, there's been more writing about recently, that particularly in architecture practices, it's not typically built into the scope of services. And so people who sort of value that end up sort of putting in the labor to make this happen. I know in urban planning, it's a little different, and you're sort of a hybrid case, but even in designing these objects, these sort of beautiful tables and furniture, it's certainly going above and beyond, I'm sure, what the brief was. So I'm wondering just about your take on that issue of, the labor of community engagement in a way that the inefficiency of it, which yields other kinds of value, but how do you make the case for that, in the context in which you're working, and how do you make that work for yourselves as a practice?
I would say it's actually easier and easier. We've had the good fortune to have some really good clients who really believe in community engagement, who see the value in it. And frankly, I think that's sometimes why we go after a project through an RFP process. We say right at the beginning, this is our budget. This is what we need to do for community engagement. It's going to be expensive. We're going to make this table. We're going to do these focus groups. We're going to, make these games and newspapers. But typically, clients see the value of it. And, I think there are projects that we look at that have very paltry engagement budgets. And sometimes, we always do what we can. But that's a disincentive to us, given that we value it so much, and we know it's not cheap. There's the materials of it, there's the labor of it, as you suggested. That said, we are resourceful, and we can. I don't want to. This sounds like a sales pitch. I don't. But I do want to say that a lot of the things that you saw that we showed you we're kind of made out of recycled materials, or you know, or borrowing, taking advantage of some opportunity that someone had a surplus of some material and we sort of grabbed it. So I'd say it's a kind of a combination of both of those things. Sometimes it is a little inefficient and a little bit messy. I think especially the kind of observation that we do, because observation and just sort of doing participant observation is a big part of our process. And we probably spend too much time kind of getting to know people and walking around neighborhoods, but that kind of stuff I think we do because we truly enjoy what we do, and we really love getting to know people and places. That's the best part about our job, I think.
If I can add to that also, of course, there's the other part of labor, right? The question of if we're really serious about working with people who are not professional designers, what do they, you know, how are they, what do they get out of it? Is they paid, right? Do we pay them? And we've been working a lot with this sort of gift exchange, right? That was what the whole idea of folding pattern was based on, right? We design something for you if you tell us what it is, if we can use it, right? And that was a kind of a nice way then also of getting back these programs. So that's sort of one thing, or as simple as, you know, ice cream for that conversation. But of course, that's a huge question with with projects that they're, if you're serious about more democratic planning and design project, that needs to be accounted for in a budget, ideally, right? That if people participate in some way, that they're actually not taken for granted, but that they're also doing labor, right? That's part of taking that process serious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in terms of that interface with the public, you know, I think that the sort of narrative aspects of your work and the tone are really unique, right? There's a sort of conscious playfulness and like almost fictionalizing of a situation, the drawings of cities, you know, in the study of inclusion and exclusion. There's this attempt to create sort of an alternate reality version of what might be there. And I'm curious to know if, you know, how that is part of an intentional effort to communicate with other audiences. Is there, you know, you've talked about being sort of fans of cities as, you know, community engagement because it's fun. Like there's a, maybe an intentional kind of positive spin on things that could be quite difficult and heavy. And so I'm wondering about that tone to the work and your thinking behind it.
Well, I think at least with the Arsenal, I know that we always joked that we wanted people not to know where to go in a bookstore or on the bookshelf, and that it could be read in different ways. And so I think with a lot of our work, we really try to design it in a way that it can be read through different lenses. And I think part of that is really building into our approach, trying to look at conditions from many different perspectives. And I think that when we've been talking about like where we are today, right now at this particular moment, I think that kind of empathy and trying to put yourself into someone else's shoes to see how they would read something is really more important than ever. And so I think that that's something about what we're trying to do with the ways in which we present things. And I think another way to answer that would be that we do want people to read things, and we think it should be fun. And so we have always, over the years, appropriated different kind of techniques that, you know, are outside of architecture, like, you know, the newspaper or the comic book or the graphic novel. You know, we always wanted to do a radio show, but we haven't done that yet. But, you know, I think that we think that these important issues should be accessible, and they should be presented in a way that people want to hear it and be a part of it. And so I think that also has pushed us to try different media.
There's also so much good illustration, and there's so many good urban studies books in a way that are children's books, right, that really show certain connections in cities or certain situations in cities really well through illustrations. I mean, there's all of those kids books, and there's even picture books like Kate Asher's, right? And those are where those are.
What do people do all day?
Yeah, so we have these, those are precedents for us. We're work with illustrator Lester Gonzalez, sort of as a frequent collaborator now with Richard Chan. So those are illustrators that we look to help us really use some of the techniques that picture books use to, because they're just really good at explaining certain situations or visualizing certain things in cities, just as well as, or better so than many of the drawings I think that we were, taught to use for architecture school presentations.
Right, yeah. Well, we have a lineup of some really interesting audience questions, so I want to sort of get to those while we have time. So the first one is from Ben Peterson, and he asks, what are the limits of the democratization of planning processes? Where do you find frictions with policymakers, planners, or city decision makers? What are the boundaries of total transparency, and how do you push back against these lingering opacities in your work?
Whoa, nice one, Ben. Wow, where to start? I think I heard most of that. I think the beginning was about the kind of limits of democratic planning. I think, I think something that we come across often is the idea around local control and kind of home rule, because on the one hand, of course, we're advocates for community control, and I think there's a lot of dialogue about that now, especially as communities just become completely disrupted by massive capital, and but at the same time, we see it from the other side too, right? That a lot of communities, in the name of democracy, have actually done some very, very exclusionary things. So, for example, it's really, if you look at what's going on with affordable housing in California, a lot of housing gets kind of a lot of housing initiatives and a lot get kind of shot down because a community decides that they don't want it there, and they'll come up with all kinds of reasons why they don't want it. It's not environmentally this, it's too tall, it casts shadows, it's going to overwhelm the transit system, it's going to lead to a methane explosion if we build anything along this transit line. That's in our book, in the Arsenal of Exclusion, case in Beverly Hills. But at the end of the day, people have a lot of these kind of tools at hand to say what they want and what they don't want in their communities. And while that can be a very powerful tool, it can also be a very a powerful tool for good. It can also be a very harmful tool that actually leads to kind of segregation, exclusion, and kind of inability to build any kind of public housing. So just the thing that I heard that you said was about the limits of kind of democratic planning, and that's just one thought that came to mind.
I think the other part of the question was sort of, where do you find friction with policymakers, and where do you want to push back or are able to push back on the directions that they prefer?
I mean, where to start? I'll have a lot of things to say about that. I think our book is chock full. It's the arsenal of exclusion and inclusion. I have to say, it was a lot easier to find the examples of exclusion, and despite our efforts to kind of strike a balance between the two, I think the book tends to be heavy on exclusion because there's just so many policies out there that lead to exclusion, and that we encounter all the time in our own practices. And I think one of the some specific examples might have to do with the idea of this is interesting to think about in the context of democratic planning, is just a lack of kind of any kind of regional decision-making in the states, right? I mean, people who practice planning in many European countries have the option to sort of think at a large scale and think about problems like affordable housing and resiliency across municipal lines. That's a lot harder to do here, right? And I think that this is something else we sort of wrote about a lot in the book, is this kind of tension between incorporation, let's say, and the urge to sort of have larger units of government, right, that can kind of make decisions, more enlightened decisions around some of the issues that really do plague us and need kind of larger scale, more regional thinking. Housing being a key one. Fair housing is an issue we talk a lot about in the book, and something we've all thought about quite a lot. It's a tough thing to implement on a kind of municipality by municipality in that kind of way, right? Resiliency, we worked on a big project on Long Island through Rebuild by Design. We encountered that kind of political balkanization there as well, where it was very difficult to kind of come up with large scale solutions that would have been good. But in any case, yep, Georgeen.
I was just going to add to what Dan was saying. I think it's a very, very tough question to answer, and I think it's something that we really struggle with. But I think ultimately we really we try to strike a balance between always being honest with ourselves and standing for what we think is right, but at the same time to try to keep the conversation going. And so I think that with a lot of the projects that we're doing for, let's say, governments, I think we really try to use our skills as visualizers to make really crystal clear, make visible what the issues are and try to show what is right. So Dan's talking, if in the Arsenal we do an illustration, we did an illustration about regional contribution agreements where we made very, very clear how damaging certain policies are. And I think that that's something but doing it drawing through a map that we did with Dare Brawley. And I think that it is, that's something that we still try to stick to and to use those skills to make those inequities visible and then to fight for change. But it's hard. And then the other aspect I think is maybe through not only thinking about spaces of engagement, but really trying to, in our projects, to bring different groups together and to design a process that creates a conversation between different groups that may be having different, very, very different viewpoints about a particular project. So in Detroit, in our neighborhood plan, there are very, very different ideas about what should happen in the neighborhood, and we try to create a setting where people can come together and talk about it. And so it doesn't solve all the problems in the world, but I think that we try to, through both kind of making visible what we think is good and right, and then at the same time trying to bring people together in conversation, we try to move things forward.
Great, yeah. So I think we should follow that tough question actually with an even tougher one that was asked by Rachel Begane. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And so she calls attention to the fact that we are four white faces talking about issues of social inequity. And, it's long, so I'm sort of summarizing this, but making the point that part of the reason why space is inequitable is related to who the system privileges, read white architects and planners, people that shape the built environment. So her question is, and really to all four of us, how is it that your office in particular addresses its own privileges, both within your office and while working with community groups?
That's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up. Just to start with the second part of the question, again, I think this is, we all have a lot of learning to do I think especially now, you know, I think the process of becoming an anti-racist is just discovering the racism that is in you, in your profession, in your office. And so I think we're always in a process of just trying to become aware of our kind of biases. I think that in terms of working with communities, one practical thing that we always do is we always partner with local organizations. So when we do whatever project we're working in, the first thing we do is that we never do projects alone. All the stuff that you saw, all the projects we presented, they're all projects we did with a lot of you know, consultants and partners. And we always try to find organizations that are in the place we work in and that are represented by and led by people who look like the places that we're working in. And that's kind of our way of building trust, just on a kind of practical level. I don't know if others want to add.
Any other thoughts?
It's not. I hope that was a sufficient answer to what I think was a very good and a very important question.
I'm wondering if there's like any particular communication that you do about that too. You know, are there moments where you ever address it explicitly when meeting with partners, or just sort of acknowledge your own position in the room and how it might, you know, influence your perspective?
It is, and it can be almost it can really become an obstacle, right? Where you are in a meeting and you think, you know, what am I doing here? There's sort of sense of one's own position. Also, those dynamics are weighing heavily on us, and can really be an obstacle in that way. So it's something we're, you know, obviously something we work with all the time. I mean, as practitioners, as educators as well, right? As people who are sort of aware of the just incredible inequities, not only in the city, but also in our own profession, and how can we change that, the ridiculous situation that we have in architecture and planning right now in this country, of who is in these offices, who actually does the architecture, does the design.
I would also add that I think that we have lots to do, but I think that we try to, even within our own office, we're trying to cultivate a space where we can share our own, every person's perspective, and to try to bring that to the table in the life of the office. And I know that in the past 2 weeks, there, within our own team, which is like amazing group of people that we rely on so much as partners. We try to bring and to build our team with as much diversity as we can, from like different perspectives and area of expertise and age and race and gender. And being a small office, we are not unlimited in what we can do, because we don't have unlimited resources, but we do try to create a space where even within our own selves, we have different opinions, and we try to create a space where that can be talked about openly. And I'm really thankful for the people in our office who are actually pushing us to more deeply engage with those questions.
Thank you. Thank you for all those thoughtful responses. And I would just share, similarly, I think when I'm doing projects involving community engagement, that I sort of go into them with the assumption that I don't know, I can't speak to the experience of people in a place. And it's a process of learning from groups or individuals who represent the residents of a particular place or the creative sort of practitioners there. And I would sort of point to the issue of log also as a place where there are many incredible writers and practitioners talking about how, you know, working to improve these problems is both a systemic thing and an interpersonal thing, and that it's as much about tackling policy as it is about thinking about, you know, the way that we speak to each other, the kind of words that architects use, much as you all have been talking about before, like what are the tools, how can they be approachable themselves? And I think, you know, the more people we can have working on the sort of nuance and subtlety of how racial injustice plays out, even in really tiny micro ways, I think the better off we will be. But I'm glad we had a chance to talk about that since it's so clearly important. So we have a lot of other questions. I will just try to get to some of them. So one of the questions was actually
give us an easy one this time.
Yeah. This will be
just kidding.
This is sort of a you know, a follow up, I guess you could say, a softer ball. So the question is, I would love to hear about the jump between working with communities that you're in some way embedded in, such as Detroit and New York, versus taking a big step back and looking across the US in the case of the book. Or I would add, when you're working in cities that you don't actually, you know, live in or you know firsthand, how do your practices of community engagement scale up in those contexts?
I think that.
Well, that's also another great question. Oh, Tobias, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that in a way, I would sort of also follow up on something that Dan said before, that in many cases, and you know, every project is different and so on, but in many cases also really we're more, you know, coordinating or finding groups that know the place better, and finding partners on the ground, and so on, right? So to really, of course, take the position that we can know a place, can know the people in a place, and therefore, you know, do our homework and find the right people that we want to work with and that we want to partner up with. So that's one way in which we work in places that we don't know as well.
Mm-hmm. And I guess getting to the sort of, you know, question of distance as well, which is going to be potentially an ongoing problem with COVID. There's a question about community meetings happening, you know, over Zoom and remotely. So the question from Alexander Schaefer, oh, and I forgot to mention the earlier question was from Evie Diamantopoulou. So this question from Alexander Schaefer is, I have seen some reporting about New York community boards and CB land use committees using Zoom to hold public meetings. The meetings had many more participants with a much different, wider reach than the in-person meetings. Do you think this type of technology should have a long-term role in the community outreach process?
Yeah, it's you know, the thing about community engagement is you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And you know, whenever we put together an engagement plan, it includes big meetings and focus groups and intercept stuff and online stuff and so on and so forth. Imagine that we've had some good luck, I think, with online meetings, and I suspect that they will become a tool in our toolkit. We won't use them exclusively. Hopefully soon we can be out there doing the kind of more analog stuff that we like to do so much. But yeah, I suspect there's a use for it in the future.
It's interesting that it's sort of that experience that there are more people participating, because it's also my experience that I'm, you know, with Zoom now, I'm just going to meetings that I would never ever go to otherwise. So that's good, right? But on the other hand, there's no way that you would be able to get in a conversation with somebody who just goes to an ice cream truck in Detroit via Zoom, right? So there are these obvious thresholds and barriers of access to the medium that you know, just limit the people whose voices are heard in these meetings very much, right? Like they always are, and online, of course, sets up a whole other barrier. I think, Georgeen, you mentioned the figure of for Detroit, right?
Right, that like in Detroit, I think also that every place is different. And so, for example, in Detroit, I think 40% of households don't have access to broadband internet. So, you know, in that case, if you were to run a community meeting there, you would be excluding, you know, 40% of the population. So I think that, like Dan said, like I think you have to try multiple things, and we try to make as many contexts as possible, but also quality interactions. And it seems that we would definitely utilize it, but I don't know ultimately what how effective and inclusive it will be.
Sorry. And we have a question from Gabo Halili, who asks, as architects and planners, our work is never done in a vacuum. There are always a lot of texts and projects by others to refer to and to read. I find that looking at those helps to creatively think about what more can be done. What are some of the works by others that you enjoy looking at?
Well, there's of course, go ahead, Dan.
No, I nominate you.
No, of course we're you know, architects and planners, so we just love most of architecture and just love to look at you know, architecture magazines and so on. I think closer to what we do, there are a couple of practices that we really admire. Most of them are actually interdisciplinary practices, such as like ours. There's, for example, Jonathan Heeswijk, who's an artist, started out as an artist, but is now just an amazing practitioner of instigating and organizing conversations about, among different communities in Rotterdam. Also in Rotterdam, there's Crimson, who do incredible work and who actually are architectural historians, right? So architectural historians who started developing projects. Who else? The initiative for the Esso Häuser in Hamburg, right? That's a great group that did use some of the similar tools to us and brought that at this point all the way to a new development plan of an area in Hamburg. So those are some of those people that come to mind that we deeply admire and that are maybe working in the same area that we do. Sorry, I'm a little Eurocentric here, it seems.
No, it's great to hear those. These are maybe outside of the radar of some of the New York audience. So that's helpful. And then maybe to sort of wrap things up and point to, you know, the current moment and next steps. There's a question about the, you know, the contrast right now between, this is from René Martin, contrast between isolation, seclusion, and then the kind of intense togetherness is coming from during the protests and marches. And does that prompt any new ideas for you about public space, or make you think of any other, as part of the question, remind you of any situations you've encountered in the past?
Before we answer that question, can I add one more New York one? The Center for Urban Pedagogy, of course, our friends and the collaborators.
That's great.
Yeah, but Tobias, you should add, this is a good, we were just talking about this a little bit, this question you just asked us, and Tobias, you were saying something interesting, not to put you on the spot, but I'm not sure I can paraphrase it better than you could just say it.
But I was still thinking about who are our New York peers. Paraphrase it in one sentence. So the question was, could you, or do you answer that?
Yeah.
Oh, so it was basically about the sort of high contrast right now between isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were talking about that in particular, in again with in the context of the arsenal. What an incredible switch that was, where as you're thinking about public space and access to public space, all of a sudden, many of the aspects of public space that we take for granted, and one of the values that we base as urbanists base our understanding of cities and particular public spaces in cities on, namely, density. We're not even questioning that anymore, that's what makes cities what's so important in cities and public space, that people should have access to it, and it's a place of encounter, or where we encounter people and practices that we sometimes don't fully understand, but just experiencing that is urban public space. I guess it's the Iris Marion Young quote. And so that we sort of take for granted, all of a sudden it's being taking care of others to not be in public space and keep to yourself. So all of a sudden everything turns around. And then simultaneously, or shortly after that, we just were all able to digest that moment. It becomes so clear how absolutely important the presence of many people together on the streets is on really changing the public discussion, right, around policy with these protests now. So this is really head spinning change of meaning of public space and being in public space and being together in public space.
And it's just so remarkable that it's been sustained. I mean, when I think back about since the middle of March, between like the middle of March up until 2 weeks ago, our whole experience of the public realm was flipped into something that we never anticipated. And then, as Tobias is saying, now it's been reversed again, and that people are demonstrating that they need to be together. But it does seem like, to make reference to the second part of the question, which is like, are there any other times? I mean, I think we're still processing it because it's so much bigger than anything that we've experienced, I think, in our lifetimes. I think it really does seem like a kind of, it's a watershed about the way that we occupy cities and the way we express ourselves amongst others in the public realm.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's impossible to sort of know where it's going to take design in the coming years, but I mean, I'm at least hopeful that it could be a catalyst for positive change, at least in terms of spreading awareness at a larger scale than previously. So yeah, well, thank you all so much. I think I might pass the baton to Rosalie.
Also,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, if there are more questions that are floating around that have been unanswered, we also, of course, if people want them to be answered, we're happy to take a crack at that later on online, if you want us to.
I'm not sure.
I was just suggesting via email. So if you can send us this question, we'd be happy to get in touch with the questioners. So.
Got it. Yeah, I'm not sure technically how we would do that now, but that would be great if you would, if people could be in touch with you directly by email. So I just want to thank all four of you and to say how much I admire you all for embracing a type of practice that actually takes on very difficult questions that are not easy to answer about whose values prevail and how knowledge is constructed. And I mean, there are clearly many questions that all of us are have to work our way through. To everyone watching, please keep an eye on the League's newsletter for the announcement of upcoming events. We're going to be doing this summer much more programming during the summer than we typically do. We hope to be announcing it in the next couple of weeks in our newsletter, and we thank you all for joining us tonight. Some of you, I'm sure, have been on Zoom all day, and it's quite something to still be on Zoom at night. So thank you for tuning into this. And again, thank you Daniel and Tobias and Georgene and Bryony for putting this program together and talking with all of us. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.